Good afternoon or good morning. Good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza, and today I'm really looking forward to talking with you about a right that might be one of the most fundamental rights we possess, a right we all spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about last year, which is the right to vote, the right to have a say in who represents you in your government, which is pretty obviously essential to the functioning of a representative democracy. So this is, as we noticed, a right that some elected officials in this country feel comfortable ignoring. And there's no clearer example of the government picking and choosing who gets a voice in democracy than the issue of felony disenfranchisement, when people who are convicted of certain crimes are stripped, sometimes permanently, of their right to vote. Now, if you're like me, the pre-2020 world is super foggy, but in the years leading up to our recent presidential election, this issue was really heating up. More states had begun exploring reforms to felony disenfranchisement, with states like Florida and Kentucky and Iowa passing laws to allow certain people to regain their voting rights when they get out of prison. Despite that marginal progress, though, the vast majority of states still operate in systems that tie participation in the political process to involvement in the criminal legal system. And many of the states that began reevaluating this made-up connection, this disenfranchisement law, also created a series of administrative hoops that people have to jump through if they want to regain that fundamental right to vote. And those hoops could very often prevent people from regaining that right. Only Maine, Vermont, and Washington, D.C. have done away with felony disenfranchisement entirely, meaning that people there never lose their right to vote based on any kind of criminal record or legal case, and they can even continue to vote while they are incarcerated. Today, more than 5 million Americans, some 2.25% of the entire eligible voting age population, can't vote due to a felony conviction. Around 1.5 million of them are still incarcerated. And like most aspects of the criminal legal system, these burdens fall heaviest on voters of color. Felony convictions disenfranchise 1 in 16 Black Americans, a rate 3.7 times greater than the rest of the population. And this is not an accident. The American tradition of felony disenfranchisement, of course, draws its roots from our legacy of slavery. In the post-slavery Reconstruction era, there was an obsession with finding new ways to disenfranchise and oppress newly freed Black people, and that is where we got felony disenfranchisement. It is not from some considered notion of not voting being somehow good for public safety. It draws its roots from slavery and the legacy thereof. So finally, the conversation around felony disenfranchisement is expanding. It's going to expand to include proposals to abolish this practice. Just last week, the U.S. House of Representatives voted on an amendment, an amendment to H.R. 1. This is why morning shows are hard for me. I wake up and I can't talk. An amendment to H.R. 1 that would have allowed people convicted of felonies to vote from within prison, a huge step forward. The amendment, which was introduced by Representatives Cori Bush of Missouri and Mondaire Jones of New York, did not pass. But it did attract nearly 100 votes from a diverse coalition of Democrats spanning the demographic and ideological spectrum. So with this newfound support, advocates are hopeful. There's a chance now to push to restore voting rights. This push may continue into the mainstream as more and more people begin to recognize that disenfranchising people based on the outcome of a racist system is by its very nature racist policy. So here to talk with us about that, about the history, about the issue, and about the future, I am so excited to be joined by Representative Mondaire Jones of New York. Congressman, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. What an issue worthy of discussion. I'm so grateful to be part of this.
Well, let's just hope the morning hasn't muddled your mouth like it did mine. So maybe you can start.
I made sure to drink some water before we started this.
Good move. Good. I'm going to learn from you. So I'd love to start by digging into sort of your personal trajectory on this issue. The idea of allowing people to vote from prison may sound to some people like it's a bit out there, and to other people it sounds totally reasonable. So I'm wondering if maybe you could help us understand why this is your position and why you felt strongly enough about it to introduce this measure in Congress.
Well, Emily, reforming our criminal legal system is a deeply personal project for me, as someone who is a Black man in the United States of America, as someone who has family members who have spent significant periods of time in incarcerated settings and who have struggled to really reintegrate themselves into society after exiting those settings. As someone who worked in the Department of Justice in the Office of Legal Policy on reducing recidivism for people leaving federal prisons. And of course, that is the rate at which people recommit the offenses that put them into incarcerated settings in the first place, allegedly. And so I carried all of that with me into this effort, along with my tremendous colleague, Cori Bush of Missouri, who's just, in addition to being a fellow member of the House Judiciary Committee, just a tremendous leader on reforming our criminal legal system, as I think the first Black Lives Matter activist to make it to the United States Congress. And we said, look, we have this historic opportunity in H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which is of foundational importance to saving our democracy. I kid you not. But what about people serving time in incarcerated settings? We always overlook that group of people, among the most powerless in our society. Why don't we ensure that we never deprive them of the right to participate civically, to help to determine who represents them in office, in this case, in federal elected office? And so for the first time in the history of the United States, we got a floor vote on our amendment to restore the right to vote to people still serving time in incarcerated settings, prison jails, and other incarcerated settings. And to your point, we got nearly 100 members of Congress to vote in favor of that. That is a turn of events, to say the least. It is a watershed moment in the way that we look at our penological systems. Of course, depriving people of the right to vote serves no penological interest, and indeed just compounds systemic racism, the new Jim Crow, frankly, for the most vulnerable among us, people of color who disproportionately serve in incarcerated settings.
So I wanted to delve into that with you because, as I mentioned at the top, this is not an issue where like a scientist studied recidivism and was like, if you deprive people of the right to vote, everyone will be a lot safer. This is something that emerges from a period in American history that we need to work very actively against. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, looking at this as an issue of righting not just a present injustice, but an historic wrong, what's it going to take, given the context of that history, to get the majority you need to push something like this forward?
Well, as I said in my floor speech during debate on this important amendment, the Reconstruction period following emancipation was unlike anything that had preceded it. Black people were elected to federal office throughout this country, including in southern states where there previously had been slavery. But we know that powerful white supremacist forces, as they tend to do even today, worked mightily to roll back that progress, such that it took, I think, another 70 years before another Black member of Congress was even elected. And in that period, white supremacists deprived people convicted of crimes of the right to vote, and then of course invented crimes to put Black people in incarcerated settings. And Michelle Alexander more recently penned a really important book called The New Jim Crow, which has to do with mass incarceration, but is related to this idea that there has been a very coordinated effort in this country to not only oppress Black and brown people through incarcerating them, but to deprive them of all of the privileges that we would associate with citizenship. We see it in the collateral consequences associated with folks who have convictions, until recently not being able to get a Pell Grant, not being able to benefit from federally subsidized housing, and all these other things that should not be punishments for people who are supposed to have been rehabilitated, and certainly who have served their time for whatever they were convicted of. And the deprivation of the right to vote is part of that group of collateral consequences that serves no penological interest, but rather serves to make it more likely, if anything, that people find themselves in a situation where they commit crimes all over again. And again, depriving people of the right to vote is also anti-American. It is anti-small d democratic. We should be encouraging people to vote. And we know from the research, in fact, that people voting actually reduces the rate of recidivism.
Mm-hmm. So I'm excited to talk about that. That's a great point about the public safety point. Because all the things you mentioned, all of these collateral consequences, these enmeshed penalties, are all things that, when taken away, really harm someone's ability to succeed. So I wanted to sort of loop back into what this says about the way we as a nation feel about the importance of, the humanity of, the success of, the futures of people who have been incarcerated. And I wanted to drill down with you on political representation there more broadly. People in prison, of course, get counted in the census for the purpose of allocating federal dollars, right? And in most places, they get counted as residents in the district in which they are incarcerated, meaning that the district where the prison lies gets more power, and the places where people have been taken from in order to go to prison get less power. And the residents who are being counted for this purpose of apportionment don't get to vote. So I'm wondering if you could talk about like what this means to you when you look at this. What does this say to you about our country's values when it comes to political participation?
We have, through our policies, subjugated Black people and further exploited them. And when I say Black people, I mean Black people, Hispanic people, and other brown people who find themselves too often intentionally by government actors on the short end of the stick, so to speak. You know, we know that there are so many disparities in our criminal legal system, from the great difficulty getting quality counsel to, as I mentioned earlier, the collateral consequences that compound a quite racist group set of systems for Black and brown people. But when I look at something like the fact, as I mentioned also on the House floor, that you count people for purposes of the census, but then you also deprive them of the ability to vote to determine who represents them in Congress, for example, which is what our amendment would address, because it's an amendment to federal legislation. It reminds me of the fact that in this country, more formally, Black people were treated as 3/5 of a human being, right? So you get counted for purpose of the allocation of federal and other resources, but you don't have the privileges associated with citizenship, despite the fact that you are indeed a United States citizen. There is no coherent argument, certainly no empirical penological interest in doing that. It is simply meant to suppress or reduce the political power of people who are already marginalized in our society. And that's why I'm so excited to have introduced that amendment with Cori Bush, because it would begin the process of remedying that great injustice.
So let's talk about what that injustice looks like when remedied. Because in Maine, Vermont, and DC, of course, nobody can take away your right to vote. Can you talk about what that scenario looks like and what your vision is, what it would look like if scaled up nationally?
We deserve a civilized society. And in a civilized society, no one's right to vote is ever taken away from them, because we don't take away people's citizenship in this country. If you were convicted of a crime and you were sentenced to an incarcerated setting, then you serve that time. But that is and should be completely unrelated to whether you have the ability to make your voice heard at the ballot box as a citizen of the United States. Again, there's no evidence that taking away the right of people to vote is helping them to not commit crimes again, or be better contributing members of our society. In fact, giving people, and or rather never taking away people's right to vote, ensures that they have the opportunity to be contributing members of our society through civic engagement. And that is what the federal government ought to be doing, taking a cue from states like Vermont, like you just mentioned, and ensuring that this is scaled up, so to speak, for every single incarcerated person, or when you talk about felony disenfranchisement, previously incarcerated person in this country.
So what I hear you saying is democracy means more voices. It means everybody's voices. You're linking the right to vote to one's citizenship, which cannot, once attained, be taken away. And I can't help but think, like, as we sit here, there are hundreds of voting rights restriction bills pending in states across the country. We're seeing like this wave of efforts to contract voting rights and to take that right, to make that right harder to get, to make the ballot box harder to access. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about the landscape right now. We've got 100 members of Congress voting to enshrine the right to vote in a way that is very protected, and we've got others across the political spectrum moving to restrict it. Can you talk about like what's happening in this moment right now?
Yeah, this is the new Jim Crow. When we look at the fact that hundreds of bills throughout the country, particularly in southern states, have been introduced by Republican elected officials for the purpose of further disenfranchising large swaths of the American electorate, particularly Black and Hispanic people in southern states, so that their voices are not heard, so that something like what happened in the November presidential election, where a multiracial coalition came together to save our democracy from the threat that was Donald Trump, never happens again. And that is because the modern Republican Party, the party of Donald Trump, cannot win on the merits of its policy ideas, and so has to resort to disenfranchising people. It is a deeply un-American concept for those of us who want America to live up to its highest ideals. And it is so transparent as to not be really rebutted by my Republican colleagues. I haven't heard any of them say, no, we're not trying to do this. Because I think most of them understand that they seem silly suggesting that they are doing anything other than trying to prevent people of color from participating in our democracy. And this is existential stuff. I mean, the same people who incited that violent insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th that I and my colleagues lived through have largely not faced consequences. And I'm talking now about people who have served and continue to serve in the United States Congress, and also the former president of the United States. And indeed, what happened on January 6th began as a big lie, a myth of mass voter fraud that has been rejected time and time again, including by Republican judges throughout this country in various lawsuits. And of course, allegations of mass voter fraud were never meant to be substantiated or proven. They were always meant to lay the foundation for another decade of racist voter suppression, like what we saw following the election of Barack Obama and that backlash. Specifically the proliferation of racist voter ID laws and the closure of polling locations in Black and brown neighborhoods, again, especially in the South, but not exclusively in the South. I represent New York State in the United States Congress, and we've had some draconian laws on the books until very recently as well, that had as their intention suppressing the right to vote, which disproportionately is suppression of the right of people of color to vote.
It's interesting to think about that angle, because I want to get into the conversations you're going to have with 97 more members of Congress in order to get more people on board and look toward the future of ending felon disenfranchisement. And that paper you mentioned earlier, I mean, I don't know if we're thinking about the same paper, but I'm thinking of the violence of voicelessness, which linked actually states with greater disenfranchisement rates to actually higher recidivism rates, basically meaning that taking away the right to vote makes people less safe. So I'm wondering if, in the context of looking at states that are taking away the right to vote in a number of ways right now, through bureaucratic hurdles or otherwise, looking at the disproportionate impact on people of color who are both credited by Democrats with having such an outsized importance in these elections and now also subject to so much more restriction. I'm wondering, you don't have to make me privy to the conversations you're going to have, but I do want to be privy to the conversations you're going to have. I want to know, when you go and talk with lawmakers who you want to get on your side about this issue, what motivates them? What is the thrust of this conversation? Does the logic of voting makes us safer prove persuasive? Is this about righteousness and justice? Is it about racist oppression? Like, what is your best case that you think will get more lawmakers behind a bill like this in the future?
If you don't mind, Emily, let me start by digging into that research that you just described and sort of like providing more context as to why this is the case. When we let incarcerated people vote, think about the incarcerated person, right? They're not sort of theorizing about the inequities in our criminal legal system. They have direct personal experience with our carceral system, with the inadequate counsel, the right to counsel, which is a right that exists on paper, but in practice all too often is not realized. They have experience with the poverty and the hopelessness and the helplessness that often leads people to committing crimes. And of course, they have experience with the unfairness and how we define crimes in this country. And so all of those really important experiences that could be transformative at the ballot box are never really able to be given political expression. And so you continue the perpetuation of these awful policies that have led to mass incarceration in this country. And so we just get better policy outcomes when we allow people to bring their lived experiences in incarcerated settings to the ballot box and allow them to participate in our democracy. And of course, when you deprive people of the right to vote, you are making them even less powerful, even more marginalized, and putting them in a situation where they feel helpless and indeed are helpless, and do things that lead them to end right back up in those incarcerated settings all over again. So it's not rocket science that giving people the right to vote in incarcerated settings reduces recidivism. In terms of the conversations that I'm going to be having with my colleagues, first, we have to make the observation that the 97 people who voted in favor of this amendment were not always, I think, in every situation able to be predicted, right? You had frontline members like Sean Casten from Illinois, who's a tremendous member of Congress, voting in favor of this bill. And then you had a bunch of folks from safely blue districts voting against this legislation. So I think we have to start by realizing that this is not about people losing elections or re-election, rather. There is something else. I think a misperception about the penological interest, if any, and I would submit there is none, to depriving people of the right to participate by voting in this case. And that means presenting them with the facts and having people who are experts on this issue, make those presentations. And of course, everyone wants to be able to act rationally, at least in the Democratic caucus. And so I think when you educate people, they'll be more open to voting the right way the next time an amendment or legislation like this gets introduced. I think it's also educating the electorate, making sure that their constituents understand everything that is at play here, and the importance of giving everyone in our society, everyone who is a citizen, the right to vote. And I got to tell you, as a newly elected member of Congress, I keep track of the number of letters. My team, we keep track of the number of letters and other outreach that we get on any number of issues. And when members start to hear from their constituents that this is an issue of significant concern, I think they're going to pay closer attention to the merits of the idea that Corey and I, Representative Bush and I, introduced.
So I hear you talking about education, public education, representative education, all kinds of education, but what's next? Concretely, what are the next steps for the campaign to abolish felony disenfranchisement?
It is working closely with advocacy organizations who I must give credit or have been doing the work for literally decades. This is long-suffering work. The work of civil rights and civil liberties in this country, which increasingly are under assault by the far right, and so making sure that we are building a multiracial coalition that includes advocacy organizations, and continuing to pick up co-sponsors one person at a time for bills like the one that Representative Bush and I introduced, educating people about what depriving people of the right to vote actually does. And also, I think, involving people in incarcerated settings and giving them a platform to talk about their experiences and what the ability to vote would mean to them. And I think all of those things, as an all of the above approach, are going to be required to be successful in this effort. But make no mistake, we have already made tremendous progress, even getting a vote on this bill. I introduced another amendment that did not even get a floor vote. Some would say it was less controversial than the one we got on the floor. And it would be to, as part of H.R. 1, this foundational democracy-saving legislation that we must enact by next passing in the United States Senate. The amendment would have created in incarcerated settings, it would have made them sites of automatic voter registration. Imagine if you were just automatically registered to vote through being in a prison, a jail, or some other incarcerated setting. I mean, that is where we need to be going as we think about automatic voter registration, which is a provision of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, and which would already enfranchise an additional 50 million people nationally. So there's a lot of educating to do around issues affecting incarcerated people, and I look forward to being a leader on that.
Well, I look forward to everything you said about government making it easy. Automatic registration, whether it's for me or someone living in a prison, I want my government to make things easy, and I appreciate that. So thank you so much, Congressman, for delving into this complex and fascinating and really important issue with us. It's been a great time having you here with us, and I hope you'll come back and visit us again soon.
Thank you. Will do. Thanks so much, Emily, for your leadership and thoughtfulness on this.
Take care. Well, at its core, this conversation, the conversation around felony disenfranchisement, boils down to how dearly we, as a society, hold the right to vote. Do we believe that the right to have a say in our democracy is inexorable, that it is entwined with citizenship? As Representative Jones just mentioned, do we believe that the right can be suspended? Can it be taken away based on the judgment of our government? The current practice of disenfranchising people, often permanently, based on legal entanglement, based on the vestiges of a racist and oppressive legal system, shows just how quick we are to discount that right and how willing we are to discount that right along racial lines. I'm thinking so much right now about what the congressman just said about lived experience, about the fact that when we come together as a society to vote on things, we're shaping what we want our country to be, right? We're voting for the things we want. We're voting against the things we don't want. Whatever our vote is, it's our voice in what our future will hold. And that includes issues about what we do when we respond to harm and transgression. That includes issues about what a prison is. Should we have a prison? What does it look like? Where does it go? And what happens when people come home? And to exclude from that conversation people who have actually lived that experience, I hadn't thought deeply about how shocking that was until the congressman mentioned it just now, that we are excluding from these important policy decisions people who may have, in fact, unique and deep expertise on these issues. So it's not just about affirming the equal dignity of everyone under the law to have a voice in our democracy. Yes, it's about that, but it's not just about that. It's about bringing people into the conversation who may be able to better shape our future. And it's also, as the congressman mentioned, it's about reintegration, right? It's about bringing somebody home in a way that says, you are important, you are a member of our community, you have a voice, we want your perspective, because all of those things, all of those forms of reintegration and acceptance and stabilization make people more able to succeed when they come home from something as difficult as prison. And let's remember, 95% of people inside come home. So these aren't conversations that are important about other people, they are important to all of us. This is the heartland of what we as a society need to hold dear and decide together. Representative Jones talked with us about H.R. 1, which was brought by him and Representative Cori Bush, and it did not pass this time. But the support it earned, 97 votes for it, may be a strong sign that we're getting closer to a juster future. This has been another episode of The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us. You can always find us on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever you like to watch a live stream video. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. So today we're going to be talking about the growing momentum behind a recent push to end the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, the phrase school-to-prison pipeline gets thrown around a lot, so much in fact that I think it's probably worth doing a little refresher on what we are actually talking about when we talk about the pipeline. Because I feel that it's important to note that the process through which kids end up in this pipeline is not a passive process. It's not incidental. Nobody slipped and fell. It's not an accident. In fact, almost everything about the school to prison pipeline is the function of deliberate policy choices and intentional actions. Chief among these policy choices is the decision to put police officers inside schools. Now, I don't want to reveal how old I am, but I'm just going to say that growing up, cops in schools were not a thing in my community. This was not always the way, it has not always been this way. Cops in schools, not even too long ago, were not generally available. Disciplinary issues that happened on school campuses were commonly held internally by the school staff, not referred externally to police officers and agents of the criminal legal system. I remember there was a very terrifying woman who hung out in our hallway and would send anyone to detention, in-school suspension, or worse, but she certainly was not a cop. Over the last few decades, though, schools have beefed up police presence to the point where roughly 43% of schools and up to 71% of high schools reported having armed law enforcement officers on campus during the 2015 to 2016 school year. And while this is the most recent year for which data is available, that trend likely only increased after the 2008 school shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, which of course sparked widespread calls for more armed police officers in schools. But let's remember, most of the time, armed police officers in schools are not going into battle against an armed shooter. They're arresting kids. They're arresting kids for having weed in their locker. They're arresting kids for scuffling in the hallway. Sometimes they're arresting kids for words. I think about this a lot because my first job as a public defender, this is way back when I was a law student. I wasn't even a lawyer. I wasn't even a public defender yet. My first summer of law school, I worked in one of the busiest juvenile courthouses in the country. And I remember the first thing I had to do was fight for a child, and I do mean a child, who had punched a bully. And the bully had been going after that child's sibling for a month, and she punched that bully. And I'm not saying that's okay. I'm not saying it's okay to punch the bully, but I'm saying that where I'm from, you might get a pat on the back, or at the very worst, you might get detention. But of course, back when I grew up and where I grew up, in that privileged circumstance, there were no cops in schools, and I'm white. For this Black child, that same action that would have gotten me detention earned her a felony that posed a risk of giving her an adult criminal record and time spent behind bars. And that's just one example. It's one example because I think it's really important to root. When we talk about policy, we got to root it in human beings. And bad cops in schools, cop decision-making in schools about who to search, whose locker to toss, whose bad attitude to construe as a criminal threat, who's just mouthing off. Like, what that means is that just like every other part of our criminal legal system, the presence of cops in schools infuses these schools with carceral racism. A study just a few years back, for example, showed that while Black students accounted for just 15.5% of all public school students, They accounted for nearly a third of all arrests in schools. And Latinx students were also overrepresented in school arrests, with all the disparities just getting worse among students with disabilities. These broader trends are accentuated by high-profile incidents of cops in schools violently detaining or arresting students as young as 6 years old. Think about that. Think about police contact starting in childhood, continual surveillance, arrests and prosecutions for schoolyard misbehavior. The disproportionate rates at which kids of color are suspended and expelled, all of it adds up to the state butchering the futures of its young people. And all of these decisions by states and schools compound, making it far less likely that kids will graduate and far more likely that they're going to end up in prison in the future. So all of that brings us, now you're situated in the subject matter. Now you're ready to talk about what we can do about this. All of that brings us to this recent push to end the school-to-prison pipeline by removing cops from schools. Now, in Massachusetts, lawmakers recently repealed a statewide requirement that all school districts in the state have at least one police officer assigned to them. That move has left just 2 states, Florida and Maryland, with laws requiring police officers in schools. And those states are looking to follow Massachusetts' lead. So to learn more now about what this campaign looks like in real life, on the ground, in Maryland, I am joined now by Maryland State Delegate Julian Ivey and Renuka Rege, a staff attorney at the Public Justice Center, a Maryland-based organization challenging poverty and racial inequality. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Renuka, before we dive more deeply into the current debate in Maryland around the school-to-prison pipeline, I'm hoping we could kind of take a step back. I touched on the roots of the current problem, but this is your field. Can you take us kind of deeper into the history of how we got to where we are today?
Absolutely. So the first place that school police officers were actually placed in schools was in Flint, Michigan in the 1950s. And the program slowly grew across the country. Many of the initial SRO, or school resource officers, is what police in schools are referred to as. Many of the initial programs were actually formed in response to protests and activism by students of color around school integration. But even by 1975, only 1% of schools across the country had formal police presence and permanent police programs. But the program continued to balloon over the next few decades. And today there's tens of thousands of police officer stations in schools all across the country. And this history of the expansion of school policing really parallels and mirrors the growth of mass incarceration writ large. And the trends that we see with mass incarceration of the disproportionate arrests and policing of people of color plays out as well in our schools with school resource officer programs.
School resource officer is such an innocuous name. Delegate Ivey, I'm wondering if you could talk with us about the history of cops in schools in your region, in the areas you represent.
Absolutely. And such an important conversation. I'm actually a product of our public schools, the youngest member of our General Assembly here in Maryland. And I bring that up because just a few years ago, I was within our public high school system, and I saw individuals really have the trajectory of their lives change because they were making fun of the school resource officer or being disruptive in class. They end up being arrested, and that ended up either not being the last time they were arrested, or they ended up dropping out from high school specifically. But we know that this is actually the purpose of these school resource officers. Ms. Rege mentioned when the SRO program was brought to the state of Maryland, they've been very effective at over-criminalizing our students and perpetuating the school-to-prison pipeline.
So I'm going to ask a question that might be a dumb question, but I really want you to walk our audience through it. How did it feel? You were in that high school not too long ago. Right. Did it make you feel safe? Did it make you feel unsafe? Like, how did you feel as a young Black man in that public school?
Well, it's not the first time that I'd seen individuals be arrested. It being the first time seeing it in a public school definitely does change what you believe that you're getting out of the experience of going to school, participating, showing up, and to see individuals who, sure, they were being knuckleheads, sure, they were making petty offenses, but they certainly didn't deserve to have that amount of authority exerted on them. And it really begged the question of why these officers are arresting these individuals, many of them African American. Specifically, 60% of all students arrested in Maryland are Black, whereas we only make up 30% of the population. And so this is not something new for young African Americans who are well aware that our police are looking to incarcerate and over-criminalize. And so to see this iteration in school is very disheartening. To be able to do something about it now as a state representative, it really does bring me joy, but we know that there's a big battle ahead because there's a lot of misinformation surrounding this issue.
So let's talk about that battle. You've introduced this legislative package to prohibit school districts from contracting with local law enforcement agencies and to reallocate that $10 million in state funding currently set aside for school police into mental and behavioral health programs. How did you decide on the structure? Why is this the solution, and what's happening with it?
Well, this legislation being proposed by a few good progressive delegates here in the General Assembly, it's been worked on with various advocacy organizations, Public Justice Center being one of them, Schools Not Jails being another, and so many other organizations as well. We know that we need more counselors in our public schools. We need more wraparound services. And the goal there to provide the foundation that so many of these students need. And sometimes individuals make bad decisions. Sometimes they need to be corrected. But to have individuals be arrested, it only does one thing, and that's perpetuate our school to prison pipeline, where we should be looking to teach students that some of the decisions they make when they're incorrect, they need to be corrected. But nonetheless, that will give you a second chance, and we certainly aren't looking to over-criminalize you. So working with the advocates, working with the various sponsors of the legislation in the committee as well, it's very clear what we're looking to achieve. And now the question is how we can actually get there.
So, Ms. Rege, I want to get your take on the divestment issue here, right? We're talking about divesting from school police and reinvesting those funds into the supportive services that were just mentioned. What's the current landscape like when it comes to things like mental and behavioral health programs in Maryland schools? And how does this match up with other more criminalizing approaches?
So the landscape of mental and behavioral services in Maryland schools varies quite a bit from district to district. There are some more well-resourced school districts that may have more services available, but even in talking with students in those school systems, for example, Montgomery County here in Maryland, we hear from the students that they may have counselors, but the counselors are so overworked and understaffed that they really only have time to focus on academics and focus on college advising and stuff like that, rather than actually providing any type of mental health support. And then school psychologists, on the other hand, school systems do have psychologists, but certainly not enough. And so they have to spend their time focusing on assessments for special education, which is one of their very important roles, but they're not necessarily available to just be providing mental health supports to all of the students who need them. So I would say the landscape varies quite a bit from system to system. Some school systems that have fewer resources may partner with organizations in the community to be able to provide referrals to their students, but oftentimes students aren't able to easily access those referrals. And on the other hand, some of our rural districts really don't have a lot of access to services at all. And so I think the landscape is very, very varied in Maryland. And so that's why it's important in this statewide legislation. Part of the goal is to, like you said, divest. So we have this $10 million state fund that's provided at the state level to districts to improve and enhance their SRO programs and potentially expand them. That's not all the funding that goes towards SROs currently. There's millions more dollars at the local county levels that are spent on SROs. And so the goal of the legislation is to take that funding and reinvest it in this type of supportive staff and personnel that we need in our schools. And actually in the legislation, the goal is to work towards the ratios, the staff-student ratios that are recommended by, for example, the American School Counselors Association and the national associations that set standards for best practices for caseloads and things like that. Speaking about funding and divestment, the Maryland Center on Economic Policy actually did an analysis of this very question. And while this information is not really easy to access, it's not publicly reported anywhere, they were able to gather information and provide estimates that overall in our state of Maryland, we spend around $40 to $50 million total on school resource officers. And the salary ranges for the school police are similar to those of school psychologists, school social workers. So we could actually do, if we chose, as a state, if we chose to reinvest our budget, we could provide a significant increase in the amount of supportive personnel that we have in our schools across the state.
So, Ms. Rege, I'm going to ask you a question, and then Delegate Ivey, I'm going to ask you to answer the same question, which is when I hear, to me, when I think about what I would want for my kid in school, I want my kid to be safe, and I don't care how we do it. And my perspective is that social workers and counselors sound great for safety, but I know there are other parents out there who might feel like, what if there is an armed shooter? Do we need to have someone on campus in case of an active shooter to keep my kid safe? And those parents may be willing to make trade-offs in pursuit of that vision of safety. So, Ms. Rege, I'm wondering if you could answer, what do you say to those parents? And then Delegate Ivey, I'd like you to answer the same question.
Yes, so I absolutely understand that concern. Keeping our students safe is the utmost concern for everyone. And, I also don't blame parents that may think that, police are necessary in order to protect our schools and protect our students, because that's really the only kind of narrative or option that we've been given. But the reality is that the research simply doesn't back up the fact that SROs or school police keep schools safer or prevent school shootings or any type of school-based violence. So, for example, there was a study done by the Washington Post of 200 school shootings and found that the school police officer was only able to intervene in 2 of those cases. So that's not really a great success rate. And then research over the past 40 years of school shootings has shown that they don't actually decrease any type of school-based violence. And actually, most recently, a study came out of Hamline University showing that when an armed officer was present at the site of a school shooting, it actually resulted in an increase in casualties and fatalities. And, the reasons for this are beyond the scope of that particular study, but some of the hypotheses that she provided were, well, if you think about the fact just having the presence of more guns on campus will lead to more fatalities. So an armed officer doesn't necessarily improve safety in that regard. So we really need to be looking towards other types of alternatives and other types of staff that can keep our students safe. Taking away school resource officers doesn't mean that we can't have other types of staff there to provide security, for example, who are not armed and who don't have the ability to arrest students for minor behavior, or provide more security with our buildings themselves. So the reality is that this is a very, very serious concern, but unfortunately, the presence of armed police officers doesn't provide the answer. And that's one of the reasons why some of the youth who were tragically experienced school shootings, for example, in Florida, the March for Our Lives movement, don't support more police in schools as the answer to school safety.
Delegate Ivey, do you want to add on to that?
Absolutely. And I've had many of these conversations with parents in my district because they're concerned with the safety of their children and their children's peers. And what I always tell them is we have to look at the data, and the data here is very clear. What these SROs are effective at doing is over-criminalizing our student population. And in fact, 22%, you're 22% more likely to drop out of high school if you've been arrested by a police officer in our public schools. And so mentioning with what Ms. Rege just mentioned, of course, that these officers actually aren't lowering the amount of crime that's taking place in or around our public schools. They're not preventing mass shootings. I always do have to recenter the conversation to what our public schools are actually aiming to do, and that's to foster growth and innovation and to encourage individuals to participate. And that's not what our SROs have been doing here in the state of Maryland.
I'm so glad you anchored it back in that question of what is a school? What is the school supposed to do? I'm curious, Delegate Ivey, about what responses you've heard from your colleagues on this proposal. And I'm also really curious about whether you've had any responses from law enforcement.
Sure. Some of my colleagues have been pointing to a small number of students that have been vocal about wanting to maintain a police presence in our public schools. And what they do is, they parade these students and say that, hey, actually, there's no support from within Prince George's County Public Schools to remove these armed officers from the public school system. And unfortunately, this is not a new tactic. This is something that we've seen before. And again, I always like to remind my colleagues here that, our public schools are seeking to engage and to increase the number of students that go out into the public and do well. And that these police officers have been hindering individuals from being able to do just that. So many of my colleagues, my classmates when I was in public school, that were arrested are not doing as well as they could be now. And there could be so many more young delegates out here in Annapolis if we just made a few changes.
That's really exciting to think about. I'm wondering if you could each just close on, if you have one thing that you want a person in your community who has never heard about this issue, never thought about this issue, maybe doesn't even have kids, what's in it for them? What's in it for the people who are entirely disconnected from this issue? And what do you want to say to those people today? Ms. Rege, we'll start with you, and then we'll end with Delegate Ivey.
Yeah, the thing that I would want people to think about, jumping off a little bit of what Delegate Ivey was talking about the few students that that may support police presence in schools. A lot of times when people are thinking fondly of their school police officers, for example, the officers are often filling a role that doesn't really need to be filled by police. And in fact, police are a poor fit for that role. So a police officer's primary job is to enforce the law whenever they see a violation. But oftentimes people are pointing to, they may have kind of a mentoring relationship, or the police officer may have been able to connect them with another resource in the community. And if we truly want more adults in our schools to fill those roles, then we should actually hire the people who are best suited and best trained to be doing those things, rather than trying to pigeonhole a law enforcement officer into that role. And if students do want to have mentoring relationships with police, they can certainly seek out those relationships in the community through community events that police departments hold, things like that. But those are voluntary, right? And so placing police in schools, that's involuntary, and it comes with real harms for some of our students. And I would just want folks to remember that and think about all of the students in our school, and that they all deserve a chance to be successful.
Delegate?
Absolutely. I always like to remind individuals that we're talking about teenagers here, and teenagers are going to make mistakes. Heck, I still make mistakes to this day. But the purpose of our public schools is to look to help individuals move forward. We spend a lot of money in our public schools, as we should, and I think we should be spending more. But we also have to understand that when we pay to have police in our public schools, when we already have the data and we know the facts, we know that it's going to lead to overcriminalization. We know that it's going to lead to more individuals dropping out from high school. So I just like to recenter the conversation. We invest so much into our public schools. Let's not make it so that we have officers moving us in the wrong direction. Let's move us forward. Let's make sure our kids have a real shot in life. And let's end this school to prison pipeline.
Well, I can't think of a better note to close the show on than that. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us to talk about this incredibly vital issue. Wishing you the best of luck as you work on this in Maryland.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as we just heard, over the last few decades, the school to prison pipeline has grown as a result of very deliberate policy choices that have led to and sometimes required more police, more arrests, more charges, more punishment for kids, teenagers, sometimes pre-teenagers. Often this, and sometimes, we've seen little kids being impacted by this. And this comes, of course, at the expense, as we just heard, of things like mental and behavioral health or restorative justice programs, things that people actually want. I think it's a great point I want to reflect on by Ms. Rege, and that Delegate Ivey also reflected, which is that when we talk about the best vision we have for school police officers, right? We talk about, they're mentoring the kids and they're, diminishing conflict and they're acting as a big brother. Well, if what we actually want is mentoring and counseling and guidance and support for kids, police don't have the comparative advantage on that. Their job is, as it was stated in the show, to enforce the law. And the most visible example that we have of what happens when you pick the wrong professional for the job is this transformation of school disciplinary issues into criminal legal problems. That, of course, was predictable. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Whenever you get the criminal legal system involved, you get racist outcomes that, especially when applied to children, massively disrupt a child's entire future. And that's why today, of course, students of color are dramatically overrepresented in school arrests, which hurts their chances of graduating, makes it more likely that they'll have more interactions with this system, more likely they'll go to prison, less likely they'll go to college. And of course, that is the exact opposite thing we should want as a community, as parents, as community members, as brothers and sisters, and as kids. Our guests from Maryland are now working on reversing this harmful decision by repealing a statewide policy requiring officers to be in schools. As they just explained, the philosophy behind this is really simple. Let's take the money that was spent on criminalizing and arresting children and spend it on the thing we actually want, which is more support for children. They dealt head on with the very difficult question of what to do if there is a school shooting, pointing out the incredible stats that were new to me, which is that, in only 2 out of 2,000 school shootings was a school resource officer able to do anything at all. Cops in schools apparently don't stop school shootings, and they don't make us safer. But what they do is cost taxpayers a lot of money to funnel Black and brown children into the prison system. It's very interesting to hear what's happening in Maryland, taking the money out of that and putting it towards what we actually want, which is a safer, more supportive learning environment in which all the kids can thrive. If that sounds like it makes sense to you, you're not alone. Now you know it. Thanks so much for joining us on the Appeal Live today. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. We look forward to seeing you again soon.